Вітаємо! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Моє ім'я Ангеліна Карякіна. Разом зі мною співведуча, журналістка.
Наталка Гуменюк. Усім привіт!
Привіт, Наталю! Сьогодні в нас розмова піде не лише про глобальну політику, але й трошечки, напевно, про медіа, оскільки твоя розмова з колишнім журналістом і великим медіаменеджером Джефрі Трімблом, який є екс-заступником директора агенції з глобальних медіа. Це агенція, яка відповідає або вже відповідала, можна сказати, за стратегічне управління американського медіамовлення і включала в себе і «Голос Америки», і «Радіо Свободу». Словом, великі і дуже добре нам знайомі медіа-активи. Отож, розкажи, будь ласка, на чому ти фокусувалася, тому що, безумовно, з Джефрі можна говорити багато про що.
Я познайомилася з Джефрі в Україні, коли ще на своїх високих посадах він приїздив до України в різний час, навіть ще, здається, до Майдану, до 14-го року. Довгий час і спілкувалася, але останні роки він вже після своєї посади викладав в університеті Огайо. Я долучалася до якихось лекцій з його студентами, і він дуже активно слідкує за подіями в Україні, усіляко підтримує. І оскільки він, скажімо так, мешкає в Центральній Америці, він зараз мешкає в штаті Міссурі, на тлі подій, які відбуваються в Міннеаполісі, вбивства людей представниками міграційної служби, мені було загалом цікаво послухати американського впливового, важливого, досвідченого журналіста, але не з Вашингтону, який би мав трошки ширший погляд, і який би міг сказати, а як воно там в Червоних Штатах, а як взагалі це сприймається все, що відбувається зараз в Сполучених Штатах з президентом Трампом. Але очевидно, що саме рік вже пройшов, відколи Сполучені Штати, нова адміністрація, скажімо так, закрила величезну кількість програм фінансових підтримки в світі, змінила формат свого іномовлення, до якого входило і «Голос Америки», і «Радіо Свобода», які формально ще на різних законних підставах вони не є закритими, так, але ми розуміємо, що рік назад майже все змінилося. Тому в цьому контексті мені хотілося з ним, по-перше, зрозуміло запитати, що там відбувається, але ми говоримо в контексті, коли американських журналістів пул змінили в Пентагоні, коли є звільнення в виданні «Washington Post», коли виходить фільм «Меланія», який схожий на рекламний ролик про першу леді. Загалом хотіла його запитати, а як взагалі він бачить, чи американські медіа опираються. Фундація довгий час, скажімо так, пропагувала свободу преси і взагалі значення свободи по всьому світі. І тут людина опиняється в центрі своєї країни, де таке відбувається. Тому, здається, для мене це був, скажімо так, найбільший поштовх розмови з ним.
Питання щодо переосмислення ролі, глобальної ролі США, в якій такі медіа, як Радіо Свобода, особливо в Східній Європі, на теренах колишнього Радянського Союзу, відігравали дуже велику роль. А чи говорили ви про те, що відбувається, в тому числі і в нас, і яке значення може мати скорочення фінансування цих служб для загалом американського впливу тут, в країнах, які безпосередньо наближені до Росії?
Я загалом скажу, що меншою мірою, тому що мене все ж цікавив це причини, як, принаймні, як виглядає сьогодні, не знаю, з Києва, як втратили так швидко якийсь ґрунт під ногами, як це здається, деякі великі корпорації, бо здавалося, що а чому вони не можуть опиратися, вони заможні, вони великі, вони багаті. А мене більше дійсно цікавило якось це пошук якихось, іноагентів почався, умовно кажучи, всередині країни, що ті, кого звинувачували в тому, що вони там працюють умовно на ЦРУ, раптом стали, скажімо так, ворогами народу в своїй країні. Але я питала багато, звісно, про Росію, саме в такому ключі, тому що чому і Джефрі слідкує за Україною, і слідкує за нашим регіоном, очевидно, він ще з кінця 70-х вчився якийсь час по одній з програм у Росії. Потім 86-го року був кореспондентом одного з великих видань і довгий час також прожив і очолював там і російську службу. І мене цікавило, як він, звісно, слідкує за переговорним процесом. Але ми говорили про дещо інше, про те, що чи виглядає це для нього як щось нове і незвичне, американська політика по відношенню до Росії зараз, да, і ось ці відносини, коли якесь відбувається зближення Трампа з Путіним. І ми чесно дійшли висновку, що він, як досвідченіша людина, якось і підкреслив, що були в американській історії приклади нічого нового, коли різні очільники намагалися говорити з великою Росією, нехтуючи, скажімо, меншими країнами. Намагалися завжди. І він був в Україні, в приміщенні Української Верховної Ради, коли сюди в 91-му році приїжджав старший Джордж Буш і казав, що та ваш там націоналізм небезпечний, і ми теж трошечки рефлексували, як його покоління тих людей, які приїздили тоді в Росію в умовах там перебудови, Радянський Союз в тому числі, він працював там він приїхав в 86-му після Чорнобиля, і я от вже тоді більше занурилася в ці запитання, бо мені стало дуже цікаво, бо він був тим журналістом, який висвітлював Будапештський меморандум, всі ці речі. І як тоді відбувалися переговори з Україною, коли Сполучені Штати намагалися домовитися з великою Україною, але дійсно не звертаючи уваги на, скажімо так, маленьких і інших. І це завжди, скажімо так, було, просто, звісно, ми переживаємо інший час, і тут я вже трошечки занурилася в ці його запитання, бо воно просто цей досвід роботи в ті часи, коли він там міг з Сахаровим обговорювати Чорнобиль, воно вже трошечки пішло ретроспективно в той бік, тому що дійсно таких людей не так багато.
Але бачиш, яка іронія долі. Чи міг би він колись уявити, що за всю свою кар'єру буде говорити про проблеми демократії і медіа, і свободи слова, і не тільки свободи слова. Насправді, у США з журналісткою з України, де журналістка з України йому буде ставити ці питання, а не навпаки. Да? Але, слухай, я тебе завжди питаю, і твій такий завжди настрій, і скажімо, якийсь компас твій власний, це завжди шукати конструктив і надію. Наскільки оптимістична була ця розмова? Тому що ти сама перерахувала купу подій. Я не знаю, чи потрапила ваша розмова на момент якраз цього масового звільнення з Washington Post, але виглядає все доволі негарно. І ми з тобою говоримо ще після того, як Трамп запостив, потім видалив цей страшний ролик з Обамами у себе в True Social, де зобразив їх як мав. Тобто якісь, я не знаю, які вже поріхи, які червоні пропорції взагалі можуть там працювати. Наскільки він оптимістично ставиться до того, що зараз відбувається?
Звучить він доволі засмученим, але я додам доволі спокійним, тому що ще один рефрен, і чому мені було цікаво з ним теж поговорити, це те, наскільки нормальним є їхнє життя в центрі Сполучених Штатів. І от, власне, це я хотіла це зрозуміти, тому що, звісно, з України зараз видається, що там все горить і палає, але це не зовсім так. Мається на увазі, що попри всю поляризацію, яка відбувається в Сполучених Штатах, він дуже багато говорив про дезінформацію, яка існує в медіа, принаймні ті американці і те середовище, в якому вони живуть як раніше. І ось це усвідомлення, тут по-різному до нього можна ставитися, да? Чи це просто нормально і таким є світ. Тобі скажу, що я не знаю, що про це думати. Я, в принципі, завжди знаю, що попри всю кризу десь є люди, які живуть щоденними своїми буднями. І, в принципі, напевно, інколи нам теж треба зрозуміти, що, Сполучені Штати і велика кількість населення не живе новинами, а умовно кажучи, можливо, і живе цими новинами, але якось живе іншим своїм життям. І я додам інше, що, звісно, я не могла просто не запитати, поставити йому питання, наскільки важливим є значення нової публікації плівок Епштейна, американського злочинця, педофіла, який був пов'язаний з великою кількістю можновладців. Я теж запитувала про значення цього. Додам, що Джефрі там багато говорив про, умовно кажучи, те, що в нас зараз дуже популярно так само говорити про роль, умовно кажучи, там КДБ і різних там ФСБ в тому, як вони працюють з іншими країнами, намагаючись якось там знайти компромат на будь-кого або створити ситуацію, коли є компромат. Хочу тобі і нашим слухачам в цій розмові сказати, що одне не виключає іншого, теж дуже обережно з тим, щоб не страшний, жахливі злочини, скоєні людьми проти неповнолітніх, проти дітей, ніяк не можуть якби просто пояснюватися і якось там вони все одно несуть відповідальність, тому не хотілося мені теж переводити цю розмову саме в не те, що в конспірологію. Так, ми розуміємо, що ФСБ могло там скористатися, і вони так завжди працювали, але це не виключає того, що робили і ці можновладці, і люди з політики, і з американські мільярдери. Ми не говорили там надто багато про це, але, здається, в цих обставинах, звісно, це ще одна величезна історія, про яку, напевно, треба буде так само десь колись поговорити, але яка дійсно так само дуже сильно все-таки впливає на американський політикум і реалії.
Що ж, давайте слухати тоді розмову Наталки з Джефрі Тримблом, екс-заступником директора агенції з глобальних медіа. Нагадаю, агенція, яка включала в себе такі великі медіа, як «Голос Америки» і «Радіо Свободу», колишнім журналістом. Слухаємо.
Ми дуже дякуємо нашим слухачам, вам за ту підтримку, яку ви здійснюєте для цього подкасту, зокрема для роботи наших чудових колег, звукорежисерки Люби Гук і редакторки Іри Лопатіної. І на прохання ваше ми це зробили. Ми створили на сторінці лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу не просто сторіночку, де ви можете донатити за реквізитами, але й можливість робити одноразовий донат і регулярний донат. Довелося нам попрацювати над цим, але тепер це можливо. Знаю, що ці донати приходять. Це дуже-дуже нас підтримує. Знаємо, що в Україні багатьох потрібно підтримувати, але якщо є така змога, щоб ці розмови далі виходили, ми вам неймовірно вдячні. Це дуже надихає. So, Jeffrey, I think that's quite clear from where I'll start, because you were the executive director of the US Broadcasting Board of Governors. Probably you'll explain in what period of times you spent so much time, and that's how we knew each other. You worked in a very, very senior position as a director of programming for RFE RL. And now, if it would be 2 years ago, I would never imagine we will speak about that. But it's almost a year since, let's say like that, the Voice of America and the whole American, the broadcasting corporation is not where it used to be. I know that there is a complex kind of legal process. The project is still alive, but it's totally something else than it used to be. Maybe you'll explain, and are you following? So where we are now with that? What actually has changed within this year? It must be obviously painful for you to observe that, but how you see where we are a year after?
It's certainly personally painful for me to see an enterprise that for 80 years, 80, projected American values, ideas, and quality news and information around the world to be more or less shut down, not completely, but certainly cut way back. This happened almost a year ago in March, when Carrie Lake, who is a strong political supporter of President Trump, was appointed initially to be the director of the Voice of America, which is one of the 5 media outlets in the U.S. international broadcasting constellation. She came into office suggesting that she wanted to reform and change the Voice of America, but within a month, so March of last year, announced, as did President Trump, that her intention was to shut down U.S. international broadcasting completely. They accused it of being biased, left-wing, radical in its programming. This was done, by the way, with no content analysis or evidence of any kind. It was just a statement, boom, we're going to shut it down. In the case of Voice of America, they were able, for all intents and purposes, to do that, to take the Voice of America off the air, because the Voice of America is a U.S. federal government agency. And so if the head of the executive branch, the president, says close down, they can close it down. Although, to come back to the legal suits, there are questions about the extent to which they actually can do that. But then things get slightly more complicated. Your listeners will know about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Svoboda. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, another of the broadcasters, is not a U.S. federal government agency. It is a private company, and it receives grants from Congress through the agency that oversees U.S. international broadcasting. So, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the other two grantees, the Middle East Broadcast Networks and Radio Free Asia for Asian countries that have closed societies, have been able to remain on the air with reduced resources because those grants have continued to come from Congress. So that's where we are today. The Voice of America has continued very minimal programming in certain strategic languages that Kari Lake has deemed to be required by law. Dari and Pashto for Afghanistan, Persian for Iran, and Mandarin for China being the primary languages that have continued. But the other language services have been shut down completely. Indeed, as you indicated, the employees of Voice of America have sued, saying that Lake did not have the legal right to take those actions for complicated reasons having to do with Congress. And this suit still is pending. So the employees are still being paid. They're still on the payroll, but they're not able to do their jobs. Their programming's not on the air. Now, maybe the most important part of this is that in the last couple of months, Kari Lake, who is a journalist by training and is a failed candidate twice, she ran for Senate in the state of Arizona, and she has political aspirations, has seemed to change her tone from wanting to shut down U.S. international broadcasting to instead wanting it to turn it into effectively a propaganda outlet for the views of the administration. So she has pushed programming on the Voice of America's remaining service that is strongly biased. It's not balanced. It doesn't represent multiple perspectives on the news. It simply is a mouthpiece for Trump administration policies. And it appears as though she's trying to do this with the other networks as well, but as yet, this has not happened.
I remember still in 2020, I talked to a colleague of mine who went from Hromadske to work to one of the services in Washington, D.C., and it was still Trump in the office. It was elections 2020 when later Joe Biden has won. But she recalled that she was coming from Moscow and she said, they told us to do this kind of, I can't watch those reports how agrarians of Iowa is kind of supporting President Trump. Because she had such a strong reminiscence of this kind of agriculture workers in Soviet Union telling how they like the party. And now we observe something very specific in the US that you don't believe that it happened randomly and all of a sudden. You all of a sudden have the journalist which would want to install the government propaganda. You'll have the publication which very easily back down. No, those workers, yes, they are suing, but in generally we saw the other cases. Yes, we understand that there is, New York Times, but it's its own empire. It's so powerful. There are, there are magazines like The Atlantic owned by the former wife of Steve Jobs. So, they're also in different position. But we've seen what happened to the Washington Post. We also have seen, the whole point with Amazon and Melania film, which is basically a clip, but which is kind of like a propaganda clip, or at least press release. Let's not speak about the political language, but I'm speaking about the language of commercials. And you kind of saw that we always saw. We will discuss later. You've been to this part of the world. We had the heritage of the decades of, controlled media. People are not used to that. So the new generation will come, they learn, and those things with freedom of the media won't happen. And now we see that there is a United States which boasted about the tradition of the free media, all those standards and everything. And I don't want to speak as kind of about whataboutism, but my question is indeed that we are surprised, like, oh, so maybe you don't need that, like, even if you have a proper base, you still go the whole way into kind of a clear propaganda mode. So how do you see the situation with the US media? And from your veteran position, do they fighting back enough, or they still don't fully understand that they're a bit too slow, like into pushing back?
If you would go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, pretty much up to World War II, the media in the United States were highly partisan, really, as they have been traditionally more in Western Europe, say. If, for instance, if someone was reading the Times of London in the UK, you could assume that person was conservative. And then we entered a period that I would say really began pretty much with World War II and going forward, of an effort to have more balanced, broader perspectives on the issues, and to not take highly partisan positions in the US media. What's happened in the last 20 years or so, and this actually precedes Trump, but it's accelerated, is that we have seen a kind of playing out of an authoritarian or an illiberal regime set of tools that cracks down on independent media or media that are critical. And I think the best example, and one that I think much of your audience would understand, is what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. And that is to use a set of tools to have, starting with takeovers of media outlets by individuals or companies that are sympathetic to the leader. Very much what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. You've named some of the names in the United States, the people and families that are taking over nationwide networks, such as Sinclair Broadcasting of radio stations. You mentioned Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, the Ellison family that's been buying up media properties. So you have allies of conservatives, and specifically Trump, buying up these outlets and beginning to try to impose their will. You have lawsuits against media outlets that distract them and that are financially draining. Yeah, I'm sure your audience knows that Trump has sued the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he's now suing the BBC, for instance. This is intimidating and challenging for media outlets. You have direct threats against journalists. If you look at Reporters Without Borders and Committee to Protect Journalists, the situation of working journalists in the United States is more dangerous today than it was because there are threats against them. There are licensing practices in that the government authorities now, our Federal Communications Commission, is taking action against media outlets allegedly for having biased content on the air. So what we're seeing in the United States under Trump is very much what we've seen already played out in some of the European countries, with Hungary being the prime example of this. So that's kind of what's going on in the moment here. And there's a broader issue that has to do with consumption of news. I mean, you tell me, what is a journalist in the digital era? Is it anyone who has access to the internet? And I mention that because 20% of Americans now say that their primary source of news and information is TikTok. Entire concept of what journalism is and where people get news and information has been changed. And the last point on that is, given how tough things are in the United States for various reasons, there are indications that many people are just tuning out of news completely. They aren't consuming any news at all because it's all so discouraging.
Still, for me, very hard to understand that maybe it's even closer to Russia, because in our case, you are not finding any excuse for the Ukrainian oligarch who owned the media. I thought that they can, stay stronger and firmer. They have money. One thing, if you're a tiny publication, sometimes there are tiny publications who fight back. But then you're kind of like thinking, why? I do understand that you can risk your business, but when you have somebody like Bezos, who at different point is the richest man on earth, and then you think, like, you're already the richest. Why do you need to bribe the president? And that's a bit fascinates me about the US, why people who are so powerful and so rich to extent it's for human hard to imagine, like for the amount of money they have. I do understand they can lose something. I can understand they can lose some of the government contracts. Like there is a very special story about Elon Musk and his dependency on the state contracts. But for me, I still don't get it because they're very powerful and very big.
So Bezos is a good case, and you mentioned Elon Musk as another example. Bezos is one of the richest, if not the richest man in the world, in large part thanks to the U.S. government. So Amazon Web Services, AWS, provides support for a wide range of U.S. government agencies, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, including, by the way, for ICE, for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that's now doing raids across the United States, including here in St. Louis, where I live. So Bezos, while he's the richest man in the world, is to a great extent because of his contracts and work for the U.S. government. So Trump indeed does have a great amount of leverage over Bezos, despite all of Bezos's wealth. But if you look back at that toolkit I was describing, other things that could be used, tax investigations, enforcement of new laws, licensing practices. You're talking about a wide array of things that even for the richest people in the world, coming up against a government is a very challenging thing to do. And Trump has enormous power as president of the United States to make life miserable for the American oligarchs if he chooses to do so. I would make just one more point about the media generally, and it has to do with one of the president's informal advisors who was much more public and obvious in the first Trump administration, and that's Steve Bannon, who is a well-known conservative podcaster now and influencer. And back in the first Trump administration, Bannon was often quoted as saying to Republican Party officials, look, the enemy is not the Democrats, as in the Democratic Party. The enemy is the press, the media. We have to break down the media. And I think if you look at what's happened in the course of the last years, coming out of the first Trump administration and getting to where we are now, through the ownership takeovers, through the other practices that I've described, we not only have a much stronger pro-right-wing biased media, but what they've managed to do is to undermine the credibility of the media in general. So even media outlets that work hard to produce fact-based materials, such as the New York Times, are finding that they don't have the credibility that media had 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because of what's been done to destroy credibility.
By the way, how are those media outlets like Fox News doing? During the first term of President Trump, they were there for him, but now there's still this mainstream media which announced that he didn't get the presidency in 2020, so he got offended. Where they are, for instance, with the protest and the murder of the people in Minnesota, how are they covering?
Fox News, interesting as is the case really with most traditional media outlets, Fox News also is losing out to some extent because its presentation of the news and its delivery is in a more traditional style. So the Fox News audience has been shifting older in recent years. Younger conservatives or people with more right-wing views are tending to follow more of the influencers or the sharper, if you will, commentators and media outlets than Fox News. So Fox News seems to many a little bit more staid and kind of conservative and careful than the more, I'll go ahead and use the word radical right-wing or conservative media outlets that seem to be pulling audience even away from Fox News. And, if you watch Fox News, you find a lot of very credible coverage about domestic, international, national security issues by the journalists, where the really strong conservative view comes through is in the commentary and talk shows that are increasingly popular over the course of the last 10 years on all of the cable news outlets, where you have people with very strong opinions sharing those opinions rather than sharing the results of factually reported news.
I want to really understand, like, with these events, like the murder of the people in Minnesota, and where things get out of hands, and there are some other things. You live in Missouri. Is the US so polarized as it used to be, and this polarization is growing, that the people are seeing two versions of reality? Or you see that there are different views? You now live in Missouri. You before, prior to that, stayed in Ohio, which is Midwest, so it's really American heartland, and part of the also quite a red state, let's say like that. So how is it? What are the mood of the people? We do understand that the New Yorkers are in shock and awe, as well as the people from Minnesota, but how about your areas?
I answer that question today somewhat differently than I would have answered it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I would have answered that the partisan divides seem to be getting deeper and deeper, and that in part is fueled by the atomization of the media markets, in that people are consuming news and information only that supports their existing views. And so they're no longer platforms on which people on the right and people on the left can meet and even have a shared set of facts. What's happened in the last 3 weeks is a backlash against the tactics being used by ICE, by the Immigration Customs Authorities, to find illegal aliens and to push back against protesters and those who are objecting to their tactics and even to some of their goals. The two killings to which you've referred that have taken place in Minneapolis seem to have had a big impact on public opinion, and we're seeing polling that many Trump supporters now, who earlier were supporting the actions against the illegal aliens in the country, are appalled by the tactics and by these killings, and so that support has fallen. So I think we're seeing less clear distinction between supporters of Trump and those who are against Trump on the issues than we might have a few weeks ago. But there's one other thing. You mentioned I live here in the Midwest in St. Louis, Missouri. The big arguments that are taking place in the country and the divisions that are being presented through the media, you really don't feel those in your daily life walking around in St. Louis, Missouri. You have neighbors who are Trump supporters, and you have neighbors who are immigrants to the United States, including Ukrainians here in St. Louis. You have liberals, you have transgender people, and they're walking in the parks, they're in the stores, they're in the cafes, they're living their lives without the kind of tension and conflict that's being stoked by the different factions in our political life. So on a day-to-day basis for people, they're concerned with issues with which people normally are concerned. The cost of food, the ability to get and keep a job, the ability to afford buying a house, the ability to afford health insurance and health care. These kinds of issues are driving people, and those cut across political divisions within the country. So you don't feel at an individual level, for the most part, away from where demonstrations are taking place, of course, and people are gathering to express their views. You don't feel the kind of tensions that are being put out there in the media in the way people are going about living their daily lives, for the most part.
Then I want to really understand who is this kind of like the loud crowd, because for me, the way to see, because that's how, just I'm speaking from where I am, yeah, and I'm stay in Kiev, but we observe what happened to Russia so many years ago. And of course, these are different countries, but when for instance, Trump speaks about the purchasing Greenland, you can't not think about Russian attempt and in this regard annex Crimea. And then you think like, okay, most people didn't care. They lived their life. They maybe didn't talk, but there was still a kind of the crowd which hears somebody saying, we'll take this part of the land elsewhere, and they're cheering up. That's where you kind of think that probably there are those people. Are they just on the Joe Rogan show, or you really see that there is something which is changed in the American society, that some of the things has been tolerated, that you kind of take the Venezuelan president and say, yes, it's not for freedom, it's for oil, like openly.
You can assume that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the American adult population will support Trump and those kinds of policies and conservative policies pretty much no matter what. Trump himself famously said years ago that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue in New York and nothing would happen to him with his base. And this has been true, I think, throughout American political history. When Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1974, having clearly been shown to have committed crimes, he still had an approval rating of over 20% of the American population. So that's a lot of people that Trump reliably can count on as a base to support him in anything that he wants to do, no matter how illogical it might seem or how much it might seem to go against the interests of those people themselves. It just is a kind of a default setting for a certain sector of the American population. And the same is pretty much true on the left. So what you've got is about half the population that may be able to independently make up its mind on individual issues. And you, out of that half of the population, you have to understand that many of them are simply completely disengaged from the political process. Right? So one statistic I think is worth keeping in mind, that in the 2024 presidential election in the United States, which Trump, of course, won, only 65% of Americans eligible to vote did so. So that's tens of millions of Americans who were eligible to vote who did not bother to go and vote. And the result was an election that Trump won the popular vote, but only by 2 million. Of course, he won the electoral vote, our peculiar political system in the United States, by quite a lot more. But Trump did not even win 50% of the votes cast in the election, and 65 million Americans didn't even bother to go vote. So it's the motivated class of individuals, whether on the left or the right, the ones who make the most noise, who logically, they're the ones you hear.
I want to ask you, as somebody coming from the BBG, look, you were the correspondent in Moscow. You know very well also running this organization, that in a lot of countries, authoritarian countries, the Voice of America, Radio Free Liberty would be always kind of suspected to be CIA. There would be this hostility towards those values. And it would be always like like the suspicion of them. How is it actually for you now, when actually everything you've been accused for many, many years, but all kind of the authoritarian governments, by being the CIA, more or less, and all of a sudden, that is something which huge part of your country, including the president, makes kind of a bad thing. Something which is, like an inner conspiracy. How do you live with that? How do you see that? How is it for you?
Where it has run into trouble with Trump is, as I mentioned again, Viktor Orban, Trump's perception and that of Kari Lake of what the role of the media is supposed to be. And they want the media to be cheerleaders for their agenda. It's actually a very Soviet model that they follow. And it's a model that I saw practiced in the Soviet Union. But that model goes against the U.S. International Broadcasting Act. So at some point, relatively soon, there's going to need to be a decision made whether these broadcasts are supposed to be simply propaganda for the administration and its views, or whether they're supposed to promote democracy and represent American values, which includes pluralism and complex discussion about the issues.
Would the movie like the Melania would have happened like a few decades ago?
If somebody had money, there's no reason why you couldn't make a movie like Melania at any time. Nobody just chose to do so in quite the way that this was done. And this movie is considered a joke and a laughingstock. It has been savaged in reviews. People are not going to theaters to see it. Of course, the director of the film is somebody who had, for all intents and purposes, been exiled already from Hollywood and has turned up in recent days in the newly released Epstein files in photographs with Epstein and with young women, which doesn't necessarily mean that he was breaking the law, but it certainly is bad company. So the thing has been just a kind of a disaster and, as I say, treated as sort of a joke by the population generally.
So it's really like in general, it's not really speaking about like there is this core of the Trump supporters, but the whole idea to, when you speak about the population in general, this is...
Yeah, I haven't heard, even from Trump supporters, I haven't heard anybody who's rushing out to see the film and to support that. You know, don't forget that for a certain part of the American conservative population, which is anti-immigrant in any case, they don't care for Melania. She speaks with an accent. She comes from an Eastern European country. So she is not necessarily popular with a certain part, even of Trump's base. And I don't want to exaggerate the size of that particular crowd because it would include people who simply are racist, in fact. But she is not necessarily a popular figure across the entire Trump base.
So the whole story of the Epstein file is big and lasting for a long time, but we also just mentioned it came to the discussion. And, you know, we are so busy in Kyiv with so many other things. And I think somehow we've really for a long time didn't follow in the detail. Some people do, but the recent release was pretty big. I really understood that it's exactly the moment when Ukrainians started to understand what was going on. What was that? How big is this thing for the US? How it can influence the audiences, the views? And also on top of that, I'll frame it the other way. Are people kind of just tolerating all those things? Because what I've been recently discussing that, you know, after Trump, you kind of think that, like, if he can do anything, does it all matter? You know, like, what is kind of the retribution because there are so many people in there. There are so many famous, very rich people in there. And you just like, would there be something for them? You know, like, I don't know.
So I would point out again that for a large, I would hope a majority of the American population, that there's nothing but disgust and anger over the revelations of Jeffrey Epstein and his actions and the people who chose to involve themselves with him. The testimony of the victims and witnesses to his crimes is horrifying, and Americans are horrified by that. What we've seen evolving with the Epstein case is that efforts to make it a kind of a partisan issue. Initially, it's that, only Republicans were together with Epstein. And then the Republicans trying to say, but there were all these Democrats. What we're seeing, I think, with the revelation of these additional materials is that Epstein's evil network of friends and collaborators reached across the entire American political spectrum from left to right, through the business community, through the political community, through parts of even the sports community and the entertainment community. So to that extent, the issue of Epstein as a kind of a partisan issue has a little bit gone away. But I will tell you, I think the most intriguing thing that is emerging with the latest release is the extent to which there were foreign actors involved in supporting Epstein when facilitating it. And guess who number one is? Russia. What a beautiful way for the Russians to gather compromat on a broad spectrum of American society, to gather information about these individuals, to get compromat on these individuals, and ultimately, with the release of this material, to cause further chaos and disruption in American society. It's an absolutely perfect, old-style KGB operation. And why that has not been obvious to everybody from the beginning, I don't know. Because to me, as a veteran of Moscow and living in the Soviet Union, it just seemed so obvious that this was an incredibly rich opportunity and target for Epstein, involving people including Robert Maxwell, who had very questionable ties when he was alive to Soviet intelligence and to Israeli intelligence, and whose daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, was Epstein's girlfriend. I mean, there are all kinds of things starting to come out and be understood in a broader context now. And I find that actually a welcome development in the Epstein story, that there's beginning to be an awareness that this is a story that's much bigger than one very evil, corrupt, sick man.
Absolutely, because it's so classical KGB, but also at the same time, I want to also stress that they sometimes, use all type of the honey traps. That's so classical, but at the same time, you just disgusted by, also the extremely rich, extremely powerful people from the establishment, which still do what they did. So for us, it's also very important to keep this kind of always of the discussion. It's not a partisan. It's about how it has been used by Russia, but also it's also about a particular culture, I could say, which did exist among those particular circles, because it's just too many people for too long.
Yeah, and seeing all of these wealthy, important people in society being brought down or involved in this is another part of demoralizing and destabilizing our society. I have to go back again with my background in Soviet studies and studying the intelligence agencies in particular. There was a defector back in the 1970s to Canada, a KGB defector, a man named Yuri Bezmenov, who went public after a certain number of years after his defection and talked quite a lot about KGB tradecraft. And he described in a number of interviews the 4 stages that the KGB, that Soviet intelligence used to disrupt societies around the world. And phase number 1 was demoralize. Just make people depressed and confused and unhappy about the situation. The second phase was destabilize, to begin to introduce elements that actually start to break the society apart. And then as the society starts to break apart, the third phase is crisis. You introduce a moment that actually collapses the society in some respect. And the fourth stage is what the Soviets referred to as stabilization or normalization, meaning the installation in that country of leadership that would be sympathetic to or cooperative with the Soviet government. Now, he was using this in largely to discuss KGB efforts in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America. But I think it's a model that's very applicable to FSB tactics that have continued, as far as I can tell, nonstop since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to try to disrupt, demoralize, and destabilize society in the United States and other Western countries. And it's perfectly logical that somebody like Epstein would be a perfect tool and player in an ongoing operation like that. I'm deeply convinced that the Russians have been very involved with Epstein and with these other efforts to destabilize our society from the very beginning.
Jeffrey, in particular, that's a good way to tell, just maybe explain a bit audience, because you have a very rich experience studying in Moscow, working in Moscow in very specific position. So actually you need to interact with if you already are the Moscow correspondent of the major American publication, with the people, and always be, on guards. So first I'll ask you a bit to tell about your experience, and then also see how you describe a modern Russia to where it went from where it started. Because you've been first in Moscow in 1979, and then there were period of the perestroika, and then the change, and then again you've been already overseeing it from further, but knowing that society and the country.
Yeah, thank you. I have had to reevaluate in the last 10 years or so my feelings about Russia and my understanding about Russia, because it has not been in this last decade and more the Russia that I thought I knew as a student of the Russian language and of Russian literature and culture, and as a correspondent in Moscow. And my feelings about Russia, and by extension, I'd have to say the Soviet Union, because were shaped by the perestroika period, which was a very unusual, and I think if you look now at the broad sweep of Russian history, a very abnormal period in Russian history. Because things, relatively speaking, and this word may sound odd to Ukrainians and to Balts and to others who were living in the Soviet Union, the relative freedom and ability to express yourself that existed when I was a correspondent in Moscow from 86 to 91, and particularly starting in about 1988, gave me an impression of a kind of a tolerance or different kind of Russia that might be preparing itself to be a true member of the wider global community of nations, right? I mean, I was able to travel freely around the Soviet Union in a way that correspondents had certainly not been able to do before. I was able to come to Kiev and spend time with the leadership of Ruch and with the independence movement. Then certainly we were monitored by the KGB, but there was no interference. I was able to go to the Baltics as the freedom chain was taking place and as events were shaping the post-Soviet landscape there. I was able to readily access senior Soviet officials, including Gorbachev himself and the leaders of the 1991 coup. So the impression that was shaped of my Russia then, I think, was in part a function of that society in which I found myself living at that particular time. I attribute much of what Russia is today as being in some ways kind of a historical return to the system of boyars and czars and old Russian Empire, where you have a central leader who nominally has control of the situation but depends on other institutions in order to be able to survive. And I think with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw a synergy take place between the KGB, some remnants of the party, and organized crime that ended up producing the Russia that we see today. And when I speak to my friends and others about today's Russia, I say you really shouldn't look at Russia as a country. You should really look at it as an organized crime family. And to understand the way it operates and the way it runs, that's a more useful comparison than thinking of it as a traditional country as we've come to understand, particularly in the post-World War II environment. I don't have very many contacts with people in Russia any longer, so it's difficult for me to really understand what's inside people's minds. But from what I can see from the quality journalism that still comes from Russia, there isn't a lot of it, but there is some. And from what we're seeing of people, of course, who've left Russia and heard about the situation there, I find myself very discouraged about prospects for true reform and change in Russia anytime soon.
How about the US-Russian relations? When you really now look into some people, and it's not exactly those people around Trump, but at least some, there is some kind of a justification that there should be some normalization, some kind of pragmatism. And then you even hear sometimes these narratives of early 90s where the US wanted to talk to a big country, to Russia. And all of us were, very, very not important. And despite everything, all those smaller countries, and Ukraine is a big one, but still needed to prove themselves. However, disregarding how Russia is, the American leadership would speak. So, there was a lot of conditionality for us. I've just yesterday watched the old report about how Ukraine was, with when the American were observing, was destroying their strategic arsenal, and it's just felt kind of odd saying that that was not allowed to us. And Russia was allowed to do whatever they want, but the US would still care. How do you see within these years this pragmatism of the American policy towards a big partner, which you today So for me, what Trump does is, of course, an aberration, but to some extent, it's not fully an aberration because you remember the periods where we were the big powers and there was something in those relations still.
It's good that you use the word aberration because it isn't really an aberration. If you look at the history of U.S. diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, remember that at the beginning of August 1991, 2 weeks before the coup took place in Moscow, President George Bush was in Kiev telling the Ukrainians in a famous speech basically not to bother Gorbachev, not to rock the boat, and the expression he used was suicidal nationalism.
Were you there, by the way? Were you listening to that speech?
Oh yeah, with amazement. That is the clearest in my mind manifestation of the kind of Russia first, better to deal with a big power, simpler to deal with a big power, potentially more stable to deal with a big power than to have to deal with these disparate countries, each of which has their own interests and concerns and challenges. So even back, if you look even at the history of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, going back to the beginning of the 1950s, there was huge debate within Radio Liberty about the extent to which to emphasize the Russian language and Russian broadcasts for the entire Soviet Union and those of what were called the nationalities. Should we have Ukrainian language broadcasting? Should we have Kazakh? Should we have Georgian? Should we have Armenian? Even to the great American diplomats such as George Kennan and others coming out of World War II, there was a preference for dealing with a strong power, for dealing with a Moscow, and not actively pursuing a policy of trying to evolve relations with the individual components of what was the Soviet Union at that time. This has been a robust debate for decades and decades and decades. When it comes to Trump, it gets more complicated, I think, because of his own personality and his background. I was in Moscow as a correspondent when he made his first visit to Moscow in 1987. He wanted to do business there. He clearly was spun right away by the Soviet authorities. He came back from that trip and took out full-page ads, right, saying, that NATO was a problem. And he's been very anti-NATO, before he got himself actively involved in politics. He wanted to do business in the Soviet Union. He has had close Russian business contacts commercially with developments in which the Russians have been involved in Trump Tower projects in Canada and elsewhere. So he has had his own history with Russia that builds on top of this institutional debate in the United States over wanting to deal with a big power as opposed to dealing with multiple entities.
I actually seen this fascinating video of a kind of a pranker of that time in early 90s who played Gorbachev coming to New York, and like people would believe it was a Gorbachev, it was an American actor, and he coming to Trump, and Trump is so pleased to see him because then Gorbachev was kind of a global celebrity, and it also shows this kind of a very special fascination. So how do you observe in this context this so-called deal? To your extent, I'm following in details, but where for you it's all heading? And even this fact of these people like Steve Witkoff, real estate dealers trying to do something, we as a journalist need to follow something which for me looks a bit like a farce and performance, but you can't disengage. And actually, Ukrainian government has to be very serious about that. But how do you see that? And how maybe how your experience of knowing Russia, the Soviet Union, knowing the relations between the US and Russia, how it helps you to understand and to read the situation?
What I can say with absolute certainty is that sending individuals who may have the personal trust of the president because they're friends or they're longtime associates, but who have no background in issues related to Russia and its history and its policies and its operations, that sending that kind of a person to deal with the Russians is a huge mistake. And that would apply to Witkoff, and it would apply to Kushner. However, in the last couple of weeks, and we're seeing this noted in the U.S. media, we have seen what might be a shift in which Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, former senator, who has very rich foreign policy experience as a member of Congress, as a member of the Senate and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, seems to be asserting more control or involvement in the negotiations with Russia and with Ukraine in trying to find a way to end Russia's war against Ukraine. So we may be seeing a kind of a shift where we're going to see people who are more experienced and have a better grasp of diplomacy and how to conduct diplomacy, which is different from conducting real estate deals, entering into the equation, and that it may affect the way the negotiations go.
How do you see the American public? I think American public is very much busy with what's happening domestically, at least those who. But you still see sometimes the odd situation in which still a huge part of the Republicans, including the Trump supporters, are still kind of quite positive about the supporting Ukraine. You still have this kind of a very unusual, for us it's already normal that this camp exists, very anti-Ukrainian, but it's there. But still there is this fracture in the Republican electorate, including inside the MAGA electorate, I guess. So it's not like fully the MAGA, I think, in this regard, can be a bit different.
Well, I'm happy to report that while indeed Americans are distracted by other issues, that polling still shows consistent majority support for Ukraine and for assistance to Ukraine. I'm happy to say, as I look out my window here in St. Louis, Missouri, I see snow, but I also see Ukrainian flags, not only in my yard, but in my neighbor's yard. So there is continued awareness of the issue. It may not have the priority that it did earlier because of everything else that's transpired and the fact that the conflict, unfortunately, has gone on as long as it has gone on. I also have to acknowledge some success, at least, by Russian disinformation efforts, not only to discredit Ukraine and its actions, and even Ukraine as a country, and questioning the legitimacy of Ukraine as a country. So the pushes that you would expect by the Russian disinformationalists. And then you also have the active measures, and again, I'm using the intelligence terminology of the FSB. You have the active measures work by Russian institutions to try to ingratiate themselves with certain parts of the American population. So we have the Russian Orthodox Church very active in reaching out and trying to form alliances and cooperation with conservative American Christian organizations, as an example, sports enthusiasts of certain kind, and other active measures things to try to get support for Russia. And I think that has had some effect with a limited part of the population. But overall, I really am gratified to say that Americans understand that this is a war that Russia began, that it's Russia's fault for what is happening in Ukraine, and it is a war on Ukraine. It's not a war of choice. And that, in fact, if Russia stops fighting, there will be no war, and if Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. I think Americans understand that.
I still am curious what happened still in the US, or it was always something there, that those FSB active measures find some fertile ground around some of the communities. Because, if you really return to the Cold War, and that's where you started your career in Russia, you thought like, oh, some things sometimes don't work. It's like active measures of the Russian propaganda probably for some time would be very hard to make them successful in Ukraine because, of the confrontation and the historical suspicion. And all of a sudden, you had such a strong anti-communism, and you had all kind of the things. And you see that you understood why some things worked in Germany, but the US not immune. And there is, for us, quite an unusual part of the society which has this kind of pro-Russian sentiment. How would you explain that from your American heartland?
As I mentioned earlier, there is a subset of the American population that will have conservative views, pro-Nazi views, for instance, certainly, that are very much out of touch with mainstream American society. But it's not insignificant. That exists in the United States. And as for active measures, even at the height of anti-communism in the United States, the Soviets were very busy with active measures. I mean, I could describe myself as a target of active measures. Here I was from the American Midwest, offered the opportunity to study as a graduate student in Moscow. I was able to study the Russian language. I was able to study culture. My university, the Ohio State University, had an exchange program that ended up being with the Pushkin Institute of Russian Language, which was an institution that was meant to teach foreigners how to be teachers of the Russian language. But that itself was active measures. They were actively trying to make me a friend, a supporter. They were taking notes on me. They were trying to figure out my personality. And that was pretty obvious from the way the instructors acted, because I was a young person and maybe I would end up being successful in some way. But they had a file on me that could show where my weaknesses might be. Do I like money? Am I homosexual? Am I, whatever. But they built a psychological profile on me, and they certainly would have put me in a file as being a potential target to develop later on. So the active measures existed, with well-intentioned Americans who wanted simply to foster peace and friendship, right? They were key targets of the Soviet active measures in those days. They were somewhat softer active measures, I guess you could say, but those active measures certainly existed. I think that those efforts continued. They simply shifted. They moved to the area of business. They moved to organized crime. They moved to other ways to build alliances. As I said, increasingly now you're seeing the Russian emphasis on conservative values being pitched to audiences in the United States that are unhappy about gay marriage, that are unhappy about transgender issues, that are not traditional values. So those active measures have continued, I think, without pause, but simply targeting American audiences and those in Western Europe and elsewhere in different ways than perhaps during the Cold War or than they're doing today.
To finalize, I think I'll ask the question, which is not that much for myself, but when I meet the people abroad who care, and especially when they kind of see somebody like you who studied in Russia, who worked in Russia, people would say, like, there is a school, there is the, different types of the institution, think tanks, and there was that amount of the specialists who knew Russia and they knew Ukraine less. And they're asking like how to change kind of the premise in a way that there would be more Ukrainian studies, that in the end there would be more languages and all those people who learned Russia. And many of them, like went to Moscow, not you were in Kyiv, but still you kind of lived more in Moscow into Kyiv. How to shift that? Now I see there are more initiatives coming. The Ukraine is more known than it used to be even 10 years ago. But do you see this shift kind of obviously that some people who were just interested in that part of the world would be keen to know Ukraine? And also, what makes a difference between somebody who studied in Russia but remained this type of a Russophile and somebody like you who understood that there is something off?
On the issue of better understanding and awareness of Ukraine, this is yet another example of the foolishness of Russia's decision to invade Ukraine in 2022. I'm not even going back to seizure of Crimea and actions in eastern Ukraine. But this action by Russia has been so foolish and so harmful to Russia in so many ways. But one of the ways in which it's been harmful to Russia is that the mere fact of the military operation and the news around that has created interest in Ukraine among people who had never thought about it before. Where is this place? What's the difference? What's it all about? Oh, there's a Ukrainian restaurant in my neighborhood. I never knew that. I'm going to patronize that. Ukrainians are different from Russians. Oh, I didn't know that. So that's at the kind of normal people level. And at the academic level, there's no question that the Russian war against Ukraine has given impetus to increase in programs specifically related to studying Ukraine, to Ukrainian studies, and for that matter, to studies of culture and languages of other countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, and including the Baltics, of course, whose incorporation was never recognized by the United States, but who were de facto considered part of the Soviet Union, that there's been an increase in those studies. So the university where I've taught, the Ohio State University, has greatly expanded its Ukrainian studies program. The Harriman Institute at Columbia University, with which I'm associated through my work with EurasiaNet, a nonprofit media outlet, has increased its Ukrainian studies. The Davis Center at Harvard, which has always been very strong in Ukrainian studies, has expanded those studies. So you're getting a perspective on Ukraine that's backfired against Russia, along with its other activities, by increasing awareness and understanding of what Ukraine is. As to those who've stayed loyally pro-Moscow, pro-Russian, I'm really at kind of a loss to explain their thinking. If you're, I suppose, a very pragmatic policy person, you may default to, as we discussed earlier, you may default to the issue of the world is a place where power speaks, and those power centers are Washington and Moscow and Beijing. And that's the reality of the world today, and we have to live with that. But for those who've actively studied and been involved in Russia, it's a little bit different. And I think that what's happened with Ukraine has helped sharpen the focus of those of us who understood that there were issues and there were problems with Russia. It's helped sharpen our focus on those characteristics of Russia throughout its history that need to be more directly addressed today.
I think that I'll end up with a question which Ukrainians just like to hear. It's not always what I like to do with our audience. Did you come for one of the first times to report the tragedy in Chernobyl? What were your first trips to Ukraine?
I was not in Moscow yet. I was still based in Rome for U.S. News and World Report magazine in April when the tragedy happened. So I was certainly involved in reporting because I was in Western Europe, and because of the activity and concern in Western Europe about the fallout, literally, from the accident, I was involved in reporting, but I was not in the Soviet Union at that time. I did visit later when I went to Kiev as part of my reporting assignments, but I was not there at the time of the accident itself. But it certainly remained big news even when I was stationed in Moscow as people who were concerned about the quality of food products. I visited a collective farm in Moldova where the collective farm had to destroy many of its crops for many years following the Chernobyl accident because of radioactivity, and talked and wrote about that. So I was exposed in that sense to the aftermath of Chernobyl. I did discuss it with Andrei Sakharov after Sakharov returned from Gorky, and I had numerous meetings, private meetings with Sakharov and with Elena Bonner, one of which he was speaking more as a physicist than as a human rights activist, and talking about the faulty design in his view of the Chernobyl type reactors and how he had opposed the construction of those reactors back at the time they're created. Quite fascinating discussion about that.
So the question which I ask, I've said, like, which is usually very pleasing to the Ukrainians to listen. What did you understand, or maybe you understand it later, the difference between the societies and countries? And actually, I think we were definitely more similar, because I think what I also insist that, disregarding the being from, like, a different ethnicities and having a different stage, different histories, we literally live in a different country and society for the last 35 years at least. So, on top, I'm speaking about Ukraine and Russia. So in a way that today it's very clear for me to explain that we, on top of everything, had lived through a very different state structure for the last 35 years in a country which doesn't claim to be a global empire. So therefore, obviously, there are different aspirations of the people just live normal life rather than to conquer the world. But what was for you your learning curve of understanding what Ukraine is?
My learning curve on Ukraine, of course, began with visits to Kiev in the late 1980s and the opportunity to meet and listen in on meetings of Ruch and its leadership, and come to understand more about Ukraine's history and aspirations at that time. But then it really gave a charge once I began to work with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and I frequently visited both Moscow and Kiev. And the difference in the environment, I'm talking starting in 1997 when I joined Radio Liberty, and going through 2007 when I left to go to the BBG, the oversight agency, my frequent visits, you could just feel such a tremendous difference in the culture, in the political environment, in the whole mindset of the people in Ukraine from that of Russia, where, of course, particularly starting after 99, when Putin came to power, and into the 2000s, the paths of the countries, you could just feel it from the moment the airplane landed at the airport at Sheremetyevo or at Borispol. You understood you were in very different countries and very different environments. And I say this with a certain amount of humility and even embarrassment, because my mother was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Ukrainian immigrant parents. And her parents had left Ukraine separately. They didn't know each other. They met only in the US, but from Western Ukraine in 1912. So it was still pre-revolutionary Russian Empire. So they did not have strong identification with the Ukrainian nation state that existed at the end of that decade, briefly before incorporation into the Soviet Union. But so I had been exposed to the Ukrainian language and to some extent Ukrainian culture, but it didn't form a big part of my upbringing, because my mother was raised very American and was of that generation of immigrants that did not particularly preserve traditions, but wanted to be American, wanted to become American, and that was their priority. So my mother didn't even, after she was a young girl, didn't even speak Ukrainian. She lost her language knowledge there. So what I'm saying about my own understanding of Ukraine, it's with a certain amount of humility, be about my own personal background, having a mother who was first generation American of Ukrainian ancestry.
You have this unique position being then like one of the top American reporters I'm returning to the Budapest Memorandum, maybe because I should admit that I'm very cautious about saying, because for a long time, unless, now you see how much has been destroyed, and that some of the, weapon which was given to Russia is killing us today. I do remember when you talk to historians, when you talk to the people who like Sergei Plokhy, who has written the whole book about that, there was no much opportunity of Ukraine not to sign that deal. It was like the pressure. It was also kind of the precondition for independence. If you read the memoirs of the Ukrainian first Minister for Defense, Morozov. So you really understand that at that time it was a very special context. It was after Chernobyl. People didn't want to have nuclear. They also wanted to build this peaceful country. But what I understood that indeed it's more like the conditionality, like the whole idea that in a way, US didn't really took any responsibility seriously, because otherwise, okay, take those nukes to the US or elsewhere, give something in terms of the security. I'm not saying that Ukraine shouldn't give. There was no such an option, but it really made Ukraine very exposed, or has given a kind of additional resources to Russia. Do you remember how, the atmosphere of the coverage? And what else to add? Now, for me, it's very easy answer why Ukraine actually speaks to Trump, why we want something from the US, not from any other country. Not from, Brazil, not from even France, because it was a different country which was in Budapest.
First, 1994 and the memorandum and concerned Kazakhstan, of course, as well as Ukraine. It itself was a manifestation of the continued Russia first priority for much of the American diplomatic and political and academic elite. First of Russia. So that's point number one. It was a historical hangover from that. Point number two is that there was a perception that Russia was on a trajectory away from its history and toward a new kind of Russia that actually could be trusted as a responsible member of the community of nations. Time has shown that this was wishful thinking. But again, think about the context. There was such relief in the West and the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War is over. We won. The threat has gone away. In retrospect, of course, that was very naive, but you have to appreciate the mood of the time, that after decades of concern and even fear, the United States I grew up in was with an understanding that within 30 minutes, we could all be killed by the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. That was the United States I grew up in. And the sense of kind of relief that we've gotten beyond that led to a kind of wishful thinking or understanding of the realities of the day that pushed aside concerns about, well, is it really safe to return these weapons? Shouldn't Ukraine be able to defend itself if need be? That the mood of the time pushed away those concerns, plus the historical preference or tendency to default to a great Russia contributed to those. Now, if you fast forward to today, while the situation's somewhat different, there's not much by way of optimism about Russia and the trajectory of Russia, but the lingering preference for great Russia as a simple power to deal with, rather than all these complex issues, still forms a part of the American diplomatic thinking about how to deal with the situation around Ukraine. But from Ukraine's perspective, I think it needs to lend a huge amount of skepticism and concern about whether any agreements that eventually would be struck to end Russia's war against Ukraine will be able to be reinforced. And I think you can understand skepticism about security commitments to Ukraine based on Trump administration actions and based on that historical precedent of 1994 and the post-Soviet environment. I'd be cautious if I were the Ukrainians as well.
Jeff, thank you. We've spoken a bit longer than planned, but I wanted to get to this Russian part, and probably it was even kind of, also all your reflections and all your experiences invaluable. So it was curious.
Well, I think that to your audience, please, that they understand that American sentiment and support of the public is on the side of Ukraine. In this conflict, there's understanding that Russia's actions are unjust and unwarranted and foolish on the part of Russia. And, of course, a desire to see this conflict ended in a way that is favorable to a sustainable, supportable Ukraine. Americans don't want to see Ukraine lose this war and everything that would entail.